If you touch her, you answer to the tribe. The voice came from the ridge before the wind could carry the last drop of river water from his sleeve, and Elias' heart did not reach for his gun, not even when the shadows began to move against the stone like men deciding something without speaking, because he had already made his choice the moment he stepped into the current and felt the pull of it try to take her under. And choices like that didn't leave room for fear, only for consequence. The river was still roaring behind him, swollen from a storm that had rolled through the Badlands an hour earlier, thick with mud and broken branches, the kind of water that didn't forgive hesitation, and now it ran past his boots as if nothing had happened at all, as if it hadn't just tried to swallow a life whole. The girl stood 10 feet away, her breathing uneven, one hand gripping the torn edge of her shoulder wrap where the fabric had given way under his grip when he pulled her free, her dark eyes fixed on him not with gratitude, but with something sharper, something older than the moment, and Elias could feel it settle in the space between them like dust after a long ride. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, not as surrender but as truth, the kind of truth that didn't need words, and for a second the only sound was the river dragging its weight through stone and the faint creak of leather as his coat shifted with his breath. She took a step back, not running, not turning, just measuring distance like it mattered now more than it had a minute ago, and Elias saw the way her fingers tightened at her side, not reaching for a weapon, but holding on to something unseen, something inside her that didn't trust what it wanted to believe. He had seen that look before, in towns where strangers were judged before they spoke, in camps where men wore uniforms like shields and forgot what they were underneath, and he had learned, somewhere between orders and silence, that the fastest way to lose a moment was to explain it, so he didn't speak, not yet, not when the wind shifted and carried the scent of sage and smoke down from the ridge, not when the shapes above them became clearer, men stepping into view one by one, their presence deliberate, their stillness louder than any shout. The girl's voice came low, almost swallowed by the sound of water. You should not have touched me, and it wasn't anger, not exactly, it was weight, the kind that belonged to rules written long before either of them were born, and Elias nodded once, slow, like he understood more than he did. Because sometimes understanding wasn't about knowing the rules, it was about seeing what they cost. He glanced up, just once, enough to count silhouettes against the sky, enough to know that whatever this moment was becoming, it was no longer just between him and her, and still his hand stayed away from the holster at his hip, fingers resting loose against his thigh as if the habit of reaching had finally worn itself out. You pulled me from the water, she said, and now her voice carried something else. Something uncertain, like a line drawn and then questioned. And Elias met her eyes, steady, not stepping closer, not stepping back, just holding ground in a way that didn't challenge, didn't claim, didn't ask for anything in return. It was the river, he answered, quiet, almost lost in the wind, not me, and the words hung there, simple, unpolished, the kind a man used when he had nothing to prove, and for a moment the tension shifted, not gone, but altered. Like a rope loosened half an inch, above them, a figure moved forward, boots finding the slope with ease, descending without hurry, without noise, and the others followed, not rushing, not surrounding, just arriving, and Elias felt the weight of their attention settle on him, not as threat, but as judgment waiting to take shape. The girl, Nayeli, though he did not know her name yet, turned slightly, enough to place herself between him and the descending men, and it was a small movement, almost nothing, but it changed the air, changed the meaning of everything that might come next. He saw it, registered it without letting it show, because in places like this, in moments like this, the smallest shift carried more truth than any speech ever could, and somewhere in that quiet space between river and ridge, between two worlds that had learned to distrust before they learned to listen, something unspoken took hold, not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it, thin as a thread, strong enough to pull two strangers into the same story whether they wanted it or not. The first man reached the bottom of the slope with the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly where he stood in the world, his boots settling into the wet sand as if the land itself recognized him, and he did not look at Elias first, not even for a second, his eyes going straight to the girl, measuring her condition, the torn fabric at her shoulder, the damp strands of her dark hair clinging to her face, and whatever he saw there passed between them in silence before it ever reached the stranger standing a few feet away. Nayeli held that gaze without lowering her chin, but Elias noticed the smallest shift in her breathing, a pause that had not been there before, and then she spoke, her voice steady now, steadier than it had been moments ago. "The river took me," she said, and it was not the full truth, but it was not a lie either, and the man listened, his expression unchanged. As the others formed a loose half-circle behind him, not closing in, not crowding, just present. Like a wall that did not need to move to be felt, Elias remained still, his hands lowered now but still open, the damp cuffs of his shirt clinging to his wrists, and he could feel their attention shift toward him in slow degrees, not curiosity, not anger, something more deliberate, as if they were deciding not what he had done, but what kind of man would do it. The leader finally turned his head, his eyes finding Elias with a weight that did not need volume to carry meaning, and when he spoke. His English was careful, deliberate, each word placed like a stone. "You pulled her from the water," and Elias nodded once, nothing more, because anything beyond that would have sounded like defense, and defense was not what this moment asked for. A long breath passed between them, filled only by the sound of the river slipping past rocks, and then the man's gaze moved again, returning to Nayeli, as if the final word belonged to her, not to him, not to any of the others, and that was when Elias understood something important without anyone explaining it, that whatever judgment stood here, it did not belong to him to answer first. Nayeli's fingers loosened slightly at her side, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to be noticed by someone who had learned to read what was not said, and she stepped forward half a pace, not away from Elias, not toward him either, but into a space that belonged to her alone. And she spoke again, quieter this time. "He did not mean harm," and the words settled into the air with more weight than the river itself, because they did not erase what had happened, they only framed it differently, and Elias felt that shift land somewhere deeper than relief, somewhere closer to respect. The leader studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not dismissal, something in between, and the circle behind him loosened by an inch, just enough for the pressure to change without disappearing. "You will come," the man said, his eyes now returning to Elias, and it was not a question, not even an order spoken with force, it was a statement shaped by expectation, and for a brief second Elias considered the distance between where he stood and the ridge above, the open land beyond, the familiar path of turning away before things grew complicated. But that path had already closed the moment he stepped into the river, and he knew it. He glanced at Nayeli, not asking, not seeking permission, just acknowledging the thread that now connected them whether either of them wanted it or not, and she met his look for the briefest instant, something unreadable passing through her eyes before she turned and began to walk toward the slope without waiting to see if he would follow. Elias let out a slow breath, the kind a man took before crossing a line he could not uncross, and then he moved, one step after another, leaving the river behind as the sound of water faded into something distant, something smaller, and the ground beneath his boots shifted from wet sand to dry earth, from uncertainty to something that felt like judgment waiting its turn. As they climbed, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed stone, and Elias noticed how the men moved without wasted motion, how they did not speak to one another, did not glance back, as if the outcome of this walk had already been decided long before he arrived, and yet there was no rush, no urgency, only a steady forward rhythm that made time feel stretched, deliberate. Halfway up the ridge, Nayeli slowed just enough for him to draw level with her, not looking at him, not acknowledging the closeness, but not avoiding it either, and after a few steps she spoke under her breath, so low that the wind nearly took the words, "You should not have stayed," and Elias let a faint breath escape his nose, something close to a quiet answer. "I figured that," and for the first time since the river, something like the edge of a smile touched her mouth, gone as quickly as it came, but real enough to change the space between them. Above, the ridge opened into a narrow pass, lined with stone and shadow, and as Elias stepped into it, he felt the world behind him fall away in a way that had nothing to do with distance, as if he had crossed from one story into another without knowing where the second one would lead, only that it would not let him leave unchanged. The pass narrowed until the sky itself felt like a thin ribbon stretched between stone, and Elias could feel the temperature shift as the sun lost its reach, the air turning cooler, quieter, as if even the wind understood this was not a place for careless sound, and the men ahead did not slow, did not look back, their steps steady, measured, as though they had walked this path 1,000 times and trusted it more than any road marked on a map. Elias followed without asking where it led, because the question would have been pointless, and because somewhere along the climb he had realized that direction no longer belonged to him, not in the way it used to when orders came from paper and men wore rank on their shoulders. Here direction came from something older, something that did not need to be written down to be obeyed. Naeli walked just ahead and to his left, close enough that he could hear the faint rhythm of her breath when the wind paused, and he noticed the way she adjusted her pace without looking, matching the terrain, choosing the smoothest line through loose gravel and uneven rock, her steps light but certain, like she trusted the ground even when it shifted, and he found himself doing the same, following not her exactly, but the pattern she set, because it worked, because it kept him from slipping, because it made sense in a way that did not need explaining. After a while, the pass opened into a small basin hidden from the wider world, a pocket of land held between stone walls where the light returned in soft angles, touching the ground in patches that moved with the passing of clouds, and there were signs of life here that did not announce themselves loudly. A line of horses tethered near a stand of scrub, the faint curl of smoke rising from somewhere out of sight, the quiet presence of people who did not rush to be seen, and Elias felt it before he fully saw it. That this place was not temporary, not a stop along the way, but something rooted, something that had been here long before he arrived and would remain long after he left. The men spread out without a word, some moving toward the horses, others toward the edge of the basin, their roles understood without being spoken, and the leader came to a stop near the center, turning to face Elias fully now. The distance between them no more than 15 feet, close enough for every detail to matter, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the calm set of his shoulders, the way he held himself not as someone who needed to prove authority, but as someone who carried it without effort. Naeli stepped aside then, not retreating, not abandoning, but placing space between herself and Elias as if to mark that what came next belonged to him to face, and Elias felt that shift like a door opening and closing at the same time. "You walked with us," the leader said, his voice steady, neither welcoming nor unkind, simply stating what was true, and Elias inclined his head slightly. "I did," he answered, "because anything more would have been decoration, and decoration had no place here." The man studied him for a moment longer, then his gaze flicked briefly to Naeli, and something passed between them again, silent, understood, before returning to Elias. "Men who come here do not always leave the same," he said, and it was not a warning spoken with threat, but a fact delivered without apology, and Elias let the words settle, feeling their weight without resisting it, because he had already begun to understand that change had started the moment he chose not to walk away from the river. "I have been told that before," Elias replied quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach without challenging, and for the first time, something almost like interest touched the leader's expression, a subtle shift that might have been missed by anyone not looking for it. A breeze moved through the basin then, carrying with it the scent of sage and wood smoke, and Elias caught sight of a small object hanging from Naeli's hand, something she had not held before, a narrow strip of leather with a piece of silver worked into it, worn smooth at the edges, the kind of thing that had been carried for years, not as decoration, but as memory, and the way her fingers closed around it when she noticed his glance told him it mattered in a way that went beyond simple ownership. "You will stay until the sun lowers," the leader said after a moment, his tone shifting just enough to mark the decision as made. "Then we will decide what comes after." And Elias nodded once, accepting it without question, because refusal was not an option he had brought with him into this place, and because something in him, quiet and persistent, told him that whatever answer waited at the end of this day would not be found by leaving early. Naeli moved then, turning slightly as if to lead him again, but this time her steps were slower, less certain, and when he came alongside her she did not look away immediately, her eyes meeting his for a fraction longer than before, searching, measuring, and beneath that, something else beginning to take shape, something that had nothing to do with the river or the men or the unspoken rules that surrounded them, something that belonged only to the space between two people who had crossed a line they did not yet fully understand. And as they walked deeper into the basin, into the quiet rhythm of a place that did not need to announce itself to exist, Elias felt that thread tighten, not pulling him back, not holding him still, but guiding him forward into a story that was no longer his alone. The basin carried its own kind of silence, not empty, not still, but full of things that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Elias felt it settle around him as Naeli led him toward a low fire pit where a thin line of smoke curled upward, bending with the breeze like it knew the sky well enough to follow its moods. No one rushed to greet them, no one stared openly, yet he could feel the presence of eyes, measured, aware, weighing him without the need to make it obvious, and it reminded him of long nights in outposts where every man knew a stranger before he ever spoke, only here there was no uniform to hide behind, no rank to lean on, only the man himself standing where he chose to stand. Nayeli stopped beside the fire and crouched, her movements careful as she reached for a small clay pot set near the coals, and Elias noticed the way her hand trembled for just a second before steadying. A detail so small it might have meant nothing to anyone else, but to him it spoke of something carried beneath the surface, something she was still deciding whether to trust or deny. He remained standing for a moment, then lowered himself onto a flat stone a few feet away, keeping his distance not out of fear, but out of respect for a space he did not yet belong to, and the warmth of the fire reached him in slow waves, mixing with the scent of sage and earth, grounding him in a place that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. "You do not ask many questions," Nayeli said after a while, her voice quiet, almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire, and Elias let a faint breath escape, something close to a thoughtful pause rather than an answer. "Questions do not change much," he said, and she glanced at him then, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she looked back to the pot, stirring it with a small wooden stick as if the motion itself gave her something to hold on to. "In your world, maybe," she replied, and there was no edge in her tone, only a statement shaped by experience, and Elias considered that, the difference between a world where questions were written down and answered in reports, and one where answers lived in the ground, in memory, in the way people moved and chose without needing to explain why. A child passed nearby then, no more than 8 years old, carrying a bundle of dried grass, and paused just long enough to look at Elias with open curiosity before continuing on, and that simple, unguarded glance carried more honesty than any adult gaze he had met since arriving, reminding him that not all judgments were made with weight, some were just questions waiting for time to answer them. Nayeli handed him a small cup filled with warm liquid, the steam rising in thin lines that caught the light, and for a second their fingers brushed. Not lingering, not deliberate, just enough to register the contact, and Elias felt it like a quiet spark, unexpected, gone as soon as it came, leaving behind something he did not name. He accepted the cup with a slight nod, bringing it close enough to smell the mixture of herbs and water, something simple, something that did not pretend to be more than it was, and he took a small sip, letting the warmth settle into him, chasing away the last of the river's chill. "Why did you not run?" Nayeli asked then, her voice softer now, less guarded, as if the question had been waiting since the moment they left the water, and Elias held the cup in both hands for a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her. "Because you would have been alone with what they thought they saw," he said, and the words came out without effort, without weight, just the truth as he understood it, and when he looked up, he saw the way her expression shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough to show that something in that answer had reached her in a place she had not expected. She studied him then, really studied him, her eyes moving over the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the quiet way he held himself, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not as tension, but as space, as something that allowed the moment to settle into something real. "You are not like the others," she said finally, and it was not praise, not accusation, simply an observation, and Elias let out a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh if it had been allowed to grow. "I have heard that before too," he replied, and this time the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly, a hint of something lighter breaking through the weight that had followed them from the river. The sun had begun its slow descent, the light shifting across the basin in long, angled beams that turned the dust into gold, and Elias knew without needing to be told that the time the leader had spoken of was approaching, that whatever decision waited at the end of this day was drawing closer with each passing minute, and yet, sitting there beside the fire, with the quiet presence of Nayeli at his side and the steady rhythm of a place that asked nothing and offered no easy answers, he felt something unexpected take root, not certainty, not belonging, but the beginning of a connection that did not fit into the lines either of their worlds had drawn, a connection that would ask more of both of them before it was done, and neither of them knew yet how much. The light in the basin shifted slower now, stretching long across the ground as the sun dipped behind the stone walls, and with it came a quiet change in the air, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of change that told a man something was about to be decided whether he was ready or not, and Elias felt it settle in his chest the same way he had felt storms roll in on open land, not with noise, but with pressure. The people in the basin moved with quiet purpose, not hurried, not tense, but aware. Conversations kept low, steps measured, as if everyone understood that this hour carried weight beyond the ordinary rhythm of the day, and Elias rose from the stone slowly, setting the empty cup beside the fire, his movements deliberate, giving nothing away that could be mistaken for unease. Naeli stood as well, brushing the dust from her hands, and for a moment she did not look at him, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the basin's edge, where the sky turned from gold to something deeper, something cooler, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same quiet weight. "They will ask what kind of man you are," she said, not turning, not softening the truth, and Elias nodded once, because that was a question he had lived with long before this place, long before her. "And what will you tell them?" he asked, not pressing, not demanding, just placing the question where it belonged, between them, and she let out a slow breath, the kind that came from standing between two answers that did not sit easily together. "That you pulled me from the river," she said, and then after a brief pause, quieter, "and that you stayed," and those last words carried more meaning than the first, because staying was not required, not expected. And yet it was the thing that changed everything. Elias studied her for a second, the fading light catching the edge of her profile, and he saw the conflict there, not weakness, not doubt in him, but something deeper, something tied to the rules she had grown within, the lines she was not meant to cross, and he understood without needing it explained that whatever she said next, whatever choice she made, it would not come without cost. "That is enough," he said simply, and she turned then, her eyes meeting his fully, searching again, as if testing whether he meant it, whether he would accept whatever came without asking her to carry more than she already did, and something in his stillness must have answered, because the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, not gone, but shifted. A voice called from across the basin, low but clear, and the leader stood near the center once more, the others gathering in a loose circle that left space open, intentional, waiting. And Elias knew this was the moment the day had been moving toward, not with drama, not with raised voices, but with a quiet certainty that felt heavier than any command he had ever followed. He stepped forward without hesitation, each footfall steady against the packed earth, the distance between him and the circle closing in a measured rhythm, and he could feel the eyes on him again, not sharp, not hostile, but present, weighing, deciding, and he did not look away, did not lower his gaze, because this was not a place where looking down would earn him anything worth having. Naeli remained where she was for a breath longer, then moved to stand just behind the circle's edge, not beside him, not fully apart, her position marking both distance and connection at once, and Elias felt that without turning, felt the thread that tied them hold steady even as the space between them widened. The leader spoke then, his voice carrying across the basin with calm authority. "You were brought here by the river, but you chose to remain," he said, and Elias inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in it, and the man's gaze did not waver. "Why?" he asked, a single word that held more weight than any speech. And Elias let the silence stretch for a moment before answering, not rushing, not filling the space with unnecessary words, because he understood now that here, meaning was found in what was left unsaid as much as in what was spoken, because leaving would have been easier. He said finally, his voice even, steady, and easy does not make it right, and the words settled into the circle, simple, unadorned, carrying only the weight he gave them, and for a moment nothing moved, nothing shifted, the basin holding its breath as if waiting to see what those words would become. The leader studied him, long enough that the fading light began to soften the edges of everything around them, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once, not approval, not judgment, but recognition of something that did not need to be named, and Elias felt it then, not relief, not yet, but the sense that whatever came next would not be decided by what he had been before this day, but by what he had chosen within it. The silence after his answer did not break the way silence usually did, it did not crack or scatter, it settled deeper, as if the basin itself accepted the weight of what had been said and chose to hold it there, and Elias stood without shifting, without filling the space, because he had learned that the wrong word spoken at the wrong time could undo something that had taken a lifetime to build. The leader's gaze remained on him, steady, unreadable, and then it moved, not away, but past him, toward the edge of the circle where Naeli stood, and in that brief shift Elias felt the center of the moment change, not from him to her, but from judgment to something quieter, something that asked not what had been done, but what it meant, Nayeli did not step forward right away. She held her ground for a breath longer than expected, her fingers tightening slightly around the strip of leather and silver she still carried, and when she finally moved it was not with hesitation, but with decision, one step into the open space, her presence altering the balance without needing to claim it. She did not look at Elias first, her eyes went to the leader, and when she spoke her voice carried both steadiness and something beneath it, something personal, something that had not been there before. He could have left, she said, and the words were simple, but they landed with more weight than any defense, because they spoke not of action, but of choice, and choice was something no one here took lightly. The leader watched her, not interrupting, not guiding, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms, and Nayeli continued, her gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again. He did not ask for thanks, and he did not ask for protection, and Elias felt that, not as praise, but as truth laid bare in a place where truth was not softened to make it easier to hear. A faint movement passed through the circle then, not a reaction, not agreement or disagreement, just a shift, like wind moving through tall grass, and Elias understood that what mattered here was not whether they believed him, but whether they believed her, and that was something he could not influence, not now, not ever. The leader inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without confirming what they meant, and then his attention returned to Elias once more. You speak of what is right, he said, his tone unchanged, but you come from a place where right and easy often walk together, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, the kind that came from watching the world long enough to see its patterns repeat. Elias considered that, the distance between where he had come from and where he now stood stretching wider in his mind, and he answered without hurry, then maybe I have been walking the wrong road longer than I thought, and the words came out quieter than before, not weaker, but more honest. Stripped of anything that did not belong, the leader held his gaze for a moment longer, and then, slowly, he stepped back, not retreating, but opening the space, signaling something without naming it, and the circle loosened again, the tension easing not into comfort, but into a different kind of awareness, one that allowed for something new to take shape. You will remain until the stars rise, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a decision that did not need to be explained. Then we will see if your path leads away or deeper, and Elias nodded once, accepting it without question, because he understood now that this was not about proving himself in a moment, but about what he would do with the time given to him. As the gathering began to dissolve, people moving back into the rhythm of the basin, Elias stepped aside, the weight of the moment still present but no longer pressing, and Nayeli moved with him, not speaking at first. The two of them walking in a silence that felt different from before, less guarded, less distant. After a few steps, she slowed, her voice low when it came. You speak carefully, she said, not looking at him, and Elias let out a quiet breath that might have been a faint smile. I learned that the hard way, he replied, and she glanced at him then, curiosity replacing the edge that had defined her earlier. And what did it cost you? She asked, and for the first time since the river, Elias did not answer right away, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the last light of the day was fading, and when he finally spoke, it was softer than before, more than I knew I had, and the words lingered between them, not heavy, not light, just real, and Nayeli held that for a moment, as if weighing it against something of her own, before giving a small nod, the kind that did not close the question, but opened it further. And as the first hint of evening settled over the basin, the space between them shifted again, no longer defined only by distance or difference, but by something quieter, something that had begun to grow in the space where neither of them had expected it. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the stone walls and left the basin in a softer kind of truth, one that did not rely on brightness to reveal what mattered, and the air cooled just enough for every breath to feel more deliberate, more present, as if the land itself was asking those within it to slow down and listen. Small fires began to glow across the basin, not blazing, not loud, just steady points of warmth scattered like quiet stars fallen to the ground, and Elias stood near the edge of one, watching the way people moved between shadow and light with a rhythm that felt older than anything he had known, a rhythm that did not rush to meet the night but welcomed it like something familiar. Nayeli approached without calling attention to herself, her steps as measured as before, yet carrying something different now, something less guarded, and she stopped beside him, close enough that the warmth of the fire touched them both without either needing to reach for it. For a moment they said nothing, the silence settling between them not as distance, but as space that no longer needed to be filled, and Elias found himself looking out toward the edge of the basin where the first stars began to appear, faint at first, then stronger, one by one, until the sky held more than it had moments before. "In your world," Naeli said quietly, her voice low enough to belong to the firelight, "when a man stands before judgment, does he always speak for himself?" And Elias considered the question, not because he did not understand it, but because he knew it was not only about him, not only about what had happened earlier, but about something larger, something that stretched beyond this place and into the paths they had both walked before they met. "He speaks," Elias answered after a moment, "but it is not always his words that decide things," and she turned her head slightly, studying him with that same careful attention she had given since the river, searching for what lay beneath the surface of his answers. "Then what does?" she asked, and Elias let his gaze drift back to the fire, watching the way the flames moved without forcing themselves, rising and falling as they chose. "What he does when no one is watching," he said. And the words settled into the quiet between them, simple, unguarded, carrying more weight than anything he had said before. Naeli did not respond right away, her fingers moving absently over the strip of leather and silver she still held, the small object catching the firelight in brief flashes that revealed its worn edges, its history, and Elias found himself watching it again, not out of curiosity alone, but because something about it felt familiar in a way he could not yet place. "This was not always mine," she said suddenly, her voice softer now, as if the words were not meant for the open air but had found their way there anyway, and Elias glanced at her, his attention sharpening just enough to mark the shift. "It belonged to someone who crossed into our land many winters ago," she continued, her eyes lowering to the silver piece. "He did not stay long, but he left this behind," and she paused, her thumb brushing the edge of the metal as if tracing a memory. "My grandmother kept it. Said it carried a story that was not finished, and something in the way she said it made the air between them change again, not heavier, not lighter, just deeper." Elias felt a faint pull at the edge of his thoughts, something distant, something tied to a past he had not revisited in years, and though he did not yet understand it, he knew enough to remain still, to let the moment unfold without forcing it into meaning before it was ready. "Stories have a way of finding their endings," he said quietly, not as an answer, but as something offered, something that might belong to both of them without either needing to claim it. Naeli looked up then, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that had lost much of its earlier edge, replaced now by something more searching, more open, and for a brief second the world beyond the fire, beyond the basin, seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between them and the quiet understanding beginning to take shape within it. Somewhere across the basin a voice called, low and steady, and Elias knew without turning that the time the leader had spoken of had come, that the stars had risen enough to mark the next step, and Naeli straightened slightly, the moment between them shifting once more, not breaking, but changing, as all things did here. She stepped back just enough to create space again, but this time it did not feel like distance, it felt like something held in place, something waiting, and Elias followed her movement with his eyes for a fraction longer than he intended before turning toward the center of the basin, where figures gathered once more beneath the growing sky, and as he took his first step forward, he felt it clearly, the quiet certainty that whatever decision awaited him would not only shape his path, but hers as well, in ways neither of them had yet begun to understand. The circle formed again beneath the rising stars, not tight, not enclosing, but deliberate in its shape, as if the space at its center mattered more than those who stood around it, and Elias stepped into that space without being called, his boots settling into the earth with a quiet certainty that did not come from confidence, but from acceptance of whatever this moment would ask of him. The firelight flickered across the faces surrounding him, casting shadows that moved like thoughts half formed, and the leader stood opposite, still as before, his presence anchored in something that did not need to be proven. No one spoke at first, the silence stretching long enough for the sounds of the basin to rise into it, the low murmur of distant voices, the soft shift of horses, the whisper of wind moving through dry grass, and Elias felt each of those things as part of the moment, not distractions from it. The leader lifted his gaze to the sky for a brief second, as if marking the position of the stars, then returned his attention to Elias, and when he spoke, his voice carried not only across the circle, but through it, steady and unhurried. "The night shows what the day hides," he said, and the words settled into the space like a truth that did not need explanation. Elias held his ground, his eyes meeting the man's without challenge, without lowering, simply present, and he waited, because he understood now that here, answers were not taken, they were given when the time allowed. The leader gestured slightly with one hand, not commanding, but inviting, and another figure stepped forward from the edge of the circle, older, his movements slower but no less certain, his gaze passing over Elias with a depth that spoke of years spent watching more than speaking, and in his hands he carried a small object, something wrapped in cloth that had seen many seasons. Naeli stood just beyond the circle's edge, her posture still, her eyes fixed not on Elias, but on the object the elder carried, and Elias noticed the way her fingers tightened again around the strip of leather and silver, the connection between the two objects unspoken but unmistakable. The elder stopped a few feet from Elias and carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a piece of silver, worn but unmistakably crafted with intent, a match not in shape, but in spirit to the one Naeli held, and the firelight caught its surface, bringing out faint markings that had been smoothed by time but not erased. The elder did not speak immediately, allowing the presence of the object to settle into the circle, to be seen, to be recognized, and Elias felt something stir at the edge of his memory, not clear, not formed, but insistent, like a voice calling from a distance he could not yet measure. This was found many winters ago, the elder said at last, his voice quieter than the leader's but carrying just as far, left by a man who walked through this land and did not understand it, and there was no bitterness in the words, only truth, the kind that had been accepted long enough to lose its edge. Elias's gaze remained on the silver, the faint markings beginning to take shape in his mind, lines that felt familiar in a way he could not yet place, and he did not reach for it, did not move closer, because something told him this was not a moment for action, but for recognition. The elder lifted his eyes to meet Elias's, searching, not accusing, not demanding, simply asking without words whether the man before him saw what was being shown, and Elias felt the answer begin to form within him, not as certainty, but as the first step toward it. The leader spoke again then, his voice steady. You stand between what was and what may be, he said. And Elias understood that this was not only about the river, not only about staying, but about something that reached further back, something tied to the object in the elder's hands and the one Naeli carried, something that had begun long before he arrived. The circle held its silence, waiting, and Elias let out a slow breath, his gaze lifting from the silver to the faces around him, then finally to Naeli, who watched him now with something that had shifted beyond doubt or judgment, something that asked him not for answers, but for truth. And in that moment, beneath the quiet sky and the steady light of the fire, Elias realized that whatever came next would not be decided by words alone, but by whether he was willing to step into a story that had already begun without him, and carry it forward without turning away. The firelight held steady as the elder's hands remained still, the silver resting in his palms like something that had waited long enough to be seen again, and Elias felt the pull of it deepen, not as memory yet, but as recognition that had not found its voice. He took one slow step forward, not reaching, not claiming, only closing the distance enough to see the markings more clearly, the faint lines etched into the metal forming patterns that stirred something beneath the surface of his thoughts, something tied to winters long past, to a story told only once and never repeated. I have seen this before, Elias said quietly, the words coming without force, as if they had been waiting longer than he had known, and the circle did not react, did not shift, it simply listened, allowing the truth to take its shape without interruption. The elder inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement that the path forward had opened a fraction more, and Elias lifted his gaze from the silver to the faces around him, then finally to Naeli, whose eyes held him with a steadiness that had changed, no longer measuring him as a stranger, but searching him as part of something she had carried for years without understanding where it would lead. My brother wore something like that, Elias continued, his voice steady but quieter now, as if the past required less volume and more care. He left home 12 years ago, heading west, said he was chasing a map that did not belong to him, and the words settled into the circle, bringing with them a presence that was not here, a man shaped only by memory and absence. Naeli's fingers tightened around her own piece of silver, and she stepped forward without thinking, the movement small but undeniable, her gaze dropping to the object in the elder's hands, then lifting back to Elias with something that could not be hidden now, my grandmother spoke of a man who came from the east, she said, her voice softer than before, touched with something that carried both distance and closeness at once. He was not like the others, she said. He listened before he spoke, and when he left, he gave her a piece of silver and said it would find its way back when it was time, and Elias felt the weight of that land fully now, not as coincidence, not as chance, but as something that had been moving long before he stepped into the river. The elder brought the two pieces closer, not touching them, but holding them near enough for the firelight to reveal their connection, the lines and curves of each forming a whole that neither could complete alone, and the circle leaned into that moment without moving, as if witnessing something that belonged not to judgment, but to understanding. Elias exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something released, and he shook his head just once, not in refusal, but in quiet disbelief at the path that had led him here. He never came back, Elias said, not asking, not accusing, only placing the truth where it belonged, and Nayeli lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. He did not leave empty, she said, and when she looked up again, there was no hesitation left in her gaze, only clarity. My grandmother said he found something he did not know he was looking for, and the words carried a weight that did not need explanation. The leader stepped forward then, his presence returning to the center of the moment, not to interrupt, but to anchor what had been revealed. The path you walk is not yours alone, he said, his voice steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen such crossings before. What was left behind has found its way back through you, and Elias stood there beneath the stars, the firelight flickering across his face, understanding now that the choice before him was no longer just about staying or leaving, but about whether he would carry forward a story that had reached across years and distance to find him. And as his gaze met Nayeli's once more, he saw it clearly, that whatever answer he gave next would not belong to him alone, but to both of them, bound now by something neither had chosen, yet neither could ignore. The two pieces of silver hovered inches apart in the elder's hands, catching the firelight like something that remembered more than the people holding it, and Elias felt the weight of that space between them as if it were measured in years instead of inches, a distance carried across time rather than land. No one spoke, because there was nothing to fill, nothing to explain, only a moment that asked to be seen for what it was. And Elias did not reach forward, not yet, because something in him understood that this was not about taking, but about accepting what had already been set in motion. Nayeli stepped closer then, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a kind of certainty that had not been there before, her hand lifting slowly until the strip of leather and silver she carried rested near the elder's, and when the two pieces finally touched, it was not with force, not with sound, just a quiet alignment that completed a shape neither had held alone. The markings met, the lines flowing into one another as if they had always been meant to do so, and a faint shift moved through the circle, not surprise, not disbelief, something deeper. Something closer to recognition, and Elias felt it settle in his chest, not as shock, but as understanding that arrived without needing permission. Some paths are not chosen, the leader said, his voice low, carrying through the stillness like a truth that had been spoken many times before. They are remembered, and Elias lowered his gaze to the joined silver, the reflection of the fire dancing across its surface, and he saw it then, not clearly, not fully, but enough, a fragment of a story passed down in silence, a man who had walked into unfamiliar land and left behind more than an object, more than a gesture, something that had continued without him. Nayeli did not pull her hand away, her fingers resting lightly against the leather, her eyes fixed on the silver as if it held something she had waited her whole life to understand, and Elias noticed the way her breathing had changed, slower now, steadier, as though the question she had carried for years had finally begun to answer itself. What was left unfinished has found its way back, the elder said quietly, his voice softer than before, and he looked between them, not asking for agreement, not demanding action, simply placing the truth where it belonged. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and for the first time since stepping into the basin, he felt something settle within him, not clarity, not certainty, but direction. The sense that whatever came next would not be guided by where he had come from, but by what stood before him now. He lifted his eyes to Nayeli, and she met his gaze without hesitation, without the guarded distance that had defined their first moments, and in that look there was no demand, no expectation, only a quiet understanding that whatever this connection was, it did not belong to one of them alone. The leader stepped back then, creating space not by moving away, but by allowing the moment to stand on its own, and the circle loosened once more, the tension easing into something that felt less like judgment and more like acknowledgement. "The night has spoken," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of a decision that had already been made. Without the need for formal declaration, and Elias felt it, not as permission, not as release, but as an opening, a path that had revealed itself not through force, but through the quiet alignment of two lives that had crossed without intention. Nayeli finally withdrew her hand, the silver separating again but no longer incomplete, and she held it close for a moment before lowering it, her expression calm, steady, as if the uncertainty that had followed her had found a place to rest. Elias remained where he was for a second longer, the firelight flickering across his face, before stepping back as well, not leaving the space, but allowing it to settle behind him, and as the circle dissolved into the quiet rhythm of the basin once more, he understood something that could not be spoken, that the choice before him was no longer whether to stay or go, but how to carry what had been placed in his hands without letting it break under the weight of two worlds that had never learned how to meet. The circle dissolved without ceremony, as if what needed to be seen had already been witnessed, and the basin returned to its quiet rhythm, fires burning low, voices soft, the night settling fully into the spaces between stone and breath, and Elias found himself standing at the edge of something he could not yet name, not outside it, not fully within it, just there, where paths crossed and did not immediately part. He moved away from the center slowly, not turning his back on it, but letting it fall behind him with the kind of respect given to places that had changed a man without raising their voice, and when he stopped, it was near the same fire where the evening had first softened between him and Nayeli. She was already there, seated on the ground with her legs folded beneath her, the silver piece resting in her hands, no longer held tight, but not set aside either, and the firelight traced the quiet lines of her face in a way that made her seem both closer and more distant at the same time. Elias lowered himself onto the flat stone again, leaving a few feet between them, not out of distance, but because something in him understood that closeness now was not measured in steps. And for a while neither of them spoke, the silence no longer searching, no longer uncertain, simply present, like the night itself. "You did not take it," Nayeli said after a while, her voice low, steady, and Elias glanced at her, then at the silver in her hands, and gave a small shake of his head. "It was never mine to take," he answered, and the words came easily, not as restraint, but as truth he did not need to think through. She studied him for a moment, then looked back down at the silver, her fingers brushing over its surface, following the lines that had once felt incomplete. "My grandmother believed some things are not meant to belong to one person," she said, and there was something softer in her voice now, something that carried memory without weight. "She said they are meant to be carried until they find where they are meant to rest," and Elias let that settle, feeling the quiet truth in it resonate with something he had never been taught, but somehow understood. A breeze moved through the basin, light but steady, carrying the scent of sage and ash, and Elias leaned back slightly, resting his hands against the stone behind him, his gaze lifting toward the sky where the stars had taken full hold, bright and unhidden, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no need to count them, no need to measure distance or direction, just to see them for what they were. "Where I come from," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, shaped more by thought than by habit. "Men hold on to things until they break," and Nayeli's eyes lifted to him again, curious, not challenging, just listening, and he let out a faint breath, "and then they wonder why they are left with nothing," he finished, the words carrying more weight than he intended, but less than he had once felt. She held his gaze for a second longer than before, something in her expression shifting not in surprise, but in recognition, as if she had heard a version of that truth before, in a different language, in a different life. "Then maybe you are not from there anymore," she said quietly, and Elias felt that land between them, not as a statement, not as a decision, but as a possibility, one that did not demand an answer, only patience. The fire crackled softly, sending a brief spark upward that disappeared into the dark, and neither of them moved to follow it, because some things were meant to rise and vanish without being held. Nayeli lowered the silver to her lap, her hands resting over it now, not gripping, not guarding, simply holding, and Elias watched the motion without speaking, understanding now that what had been revealed between them was not something to be claimed in a single moment, but something that would take time, and perhaps more than time, to understand fully. Tomorrow, she said after a while, her voice steady, you will have to choose which path you walk, and Elias nodded once, because he already knew that, had known it since the river, but hearing it spoken here, in this place, gave it a different weight, a different meaning. He looked at her then, really looked, not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as someone whose path had crossed his in a way that would not easily be undone, and for a moment, nothing needed to be said, because the silence between them held more than words could carry, and as the night deepened around them, Elias realized that whatever choice awaited him at dawn, it would not be made alone, even if he was the one who had to walk it. The night did not rush, it lingered, stretching its quiet across the basin as if it knew something important would be decided not in haste, but in stillness, and Elias remained where he was long after the fire had burned lower, his gaze fixed on the horizon that could not yet be seen, because dawn had not earned its place in the sky. Sleep did not come easily, not because of fear, but because of the weight of what had settled into him, the kind of weight that did not press down, but held steady. Asking to be carried with intention, Nayeli had not moved far. She sat a short distance away, her presence no longer something he had to search for, but something he felt without looking, like the quiet rhythm of the land itself, and at some point, without words, without agreement, they had both chosen to remain awake, as if the night itself was something to witness rather than pass through. When the first pale line of morning touched the far edge of the sky, it came gently, not breaking the darkness, but easing it aside, and Elias rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as if stepping into something that had already been waiting for him. The basin stirred with the same quiet purpose it had shown the day before, fires reduced to embers, voices low, the world not waking, but continuing. And the leader stood once more near the center, not calling for attention, but holding it without effort. Elias walked toward him without hesitation, each step measured, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this moment would define more than the path beneath his feet. Nayeli followed a few paces behind, not beside him, not distant, her position unchanged in its quiet balance, and when Elias stopped, he did not turn to look at her, but he felt her presence as clearly as if he had. The leader met his gaze, the same calm, steady weight in his eyes, and for a moment neither spoke, because the question had already been asked the night before, and the answer had already begun to take shape. You have seen what was left behind, the leader said finally, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to repeat himself. Now you must decide what you carry forward, and Elias let the words settle, not resisting them, not reshaping them, simply accepting their place in the moment. He did not look at the silver, did not search for it, because he understood now that it was not the object that mattered, but what it represented, what it connected, and what it asked of him. Where I came from, Elias said slowly, his voice steady but softer than before. A man follows the path he is given, and he paused, not for effect, but because the next words required something more than habit. But that path has never brought me here. And the truth of it stood in the space between them, simple, unguarded. The leader watched him, not reacting, not guiding, allowing the moment to remain his to carry, and Elias continued, his gaze steady. I will not return the same way, he said, and though the words were quiet, they carried the weight of a decision that did not need to be explained further. A long breath passed through the basin, not from one person, but from many, as if the land itself acknowledged the shift, and the leader inclined his head once, a small motion that held more meaning than any declaration. Then your path does not end here, he said, and stepped aside, not dismissing, not commanding, but opening the space beyond. Elias felt it then, not relief, not release, but something steadier, something that did not depend on what came next, and he turned slightly, his gaze finding Nayeli without searching, and for a moment, nothing needed to be said, because the decision had already been made, not just in words, but in the way he stood, in the way he had chosen not to walk away. She met his look without hesitation, and there was no question in her eyes now, only understanding, and perhaps something more, something that had not been named, but had taken root all the same. The morning light grew stronger, touching the basin in quiet gold, and as Elias took his first step forward into that new day, he knew that whatever lay ahead would not be shaped by where he had been, but by what he had chosen to become, and that choice, once made, would not be undone. The morning did not rush him forward, It waited, the light stretching slowly across the basin as if giving him time to understand that some choices were not meant to be followed by immediate movement, but by stillness first. And Elias paused just beyond the place where the leader had stood, his boots settling into the earth one last time as he turned back, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what he was leaving behind and what he was not. The basin had already begun to return to itself. People moving with quiet purpose, fires rekindled, the rhythm of life continuing without needing to mark his departure, and that, more than anything, told him he was not walking away from something broken or unfinished, but from something whole, something that would remain exactly as it was meant to be. Naeli stood a few paces behind him, not calling his name, not stepping forward to close the distance, and when he met her gaze, there was no urgency there, no plea, no demand for him to stay, only a quiet understanding that what had passed between them did not need to be held tightly to remain real. She lifted the piece of silver once more, not offering it, not returning it, simply holding it where the light could touch it, and for a brief second, the markings caught the sun in a way that made them seem complete even when apart. And Elias felt that in a way that did not require words, the knowledge that some things were not meant to be carried in one direction, but shared across distance, across time, across choices that did not cancel one another out. He reached into his pocket slowly and drew out a small object of his own, something he had not thought of since the night before, a simple brass button worn smooth at the edges, the last piece of his brother's coat that had survived the years. And he held it in his palm for a moment before stepping forward just enough to place it on a flat stone between them, not as a trade, not as a symbol of ownership, but as something left behind to balance what had been found. Naeli's eyes moved from the button to his face, and she did not smile, did not speak, but the way her fingers closed more gently around the silver told him she understood, that she saw the gesture for what it was, not an ending, not a beginning, but a continuation of something neither of them needed to define. The wind moved lightly through the basin, carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth, and Elias let it settle into him one last time before turning fully toward the narrow pass that led out, the same path he had walked in, but not the same path he would take away. He did not look back again, not because he did not want to, but because he did not need to, and with each step, the basin grew quieter behind him, not fading, not disappearing, simply returning to the distance where it belonged, a place held not by sight, but by memory. Halfway up the pass, he paused, just for a moment. The kind of pause that marked not hesitation, but acknowledgement, and though he did not turn, he spoke, his voice low, carried back by the wind more than by intention. "I will not forget," and the words did not ask for an answer, did not wait for one, they were simply given, placed into the space between what had been and what would be. Below, Naeli remained where she stood, the silver resting in her hand, the morning light growing stronger around her, and though she did not call out, did not move to follow, she watched until the last trace of him disappeared beyond the stone. And even then, she did not step away immediately, as if the absence itself needed a moment to settle. The basin continued its quiet rhythm, unchanged, unbroken, and somewhere beyond the ridge, Elias walked into a land that no longer felt entirely separate from where he had been, carrying with him not a piece of silver, not a promise spoken aloud, but something steadier, something that did not need to be seen to endure. Out here, the land did not remember names. It remembered choices, and sometimes, that was enough.